if it makes sense or not. So with anything in the underwriting section, it really comes down to the numbers and the different metrics that we're looking to hit. So every deal and every seller has a set of financials, and the financials will look a little bit different from one property to the next. So you'll see some things that, line up from one set of financials to another, while you'll see others that vary a bit. So as you start looking at more and more of them, you'll train your mind and your eyes to really look for things that give you some clarity on what the bigger picture is with that deal.
Right. Charles,
So,
let's start like this. First, why don't you tell people, when you're underwriting, what are some of the things that you need to request from the broker so that you can start underwriting?
Needson, that's an excellent question. So the things that you want, the most important things are your T12. So the T12 stands for trailing 12. And that means it's the last 12 months of income and expenses. And also the rent roll. So the rent roll is the current position of how many units are leased and what people are paying at the property. So the T12 gives us a good representation of the immediate past. The rent roll gives us a good representation of the very present at the property. And in the event that it's an on-market deal, you may also get an offering memorandum, which will usually have some photographs and some information about the area and other information about the deal itself. If it's off-market, meaning that they're not actively marketing it, what will typically happen is you'll get just the financials by themselves.
Okay. Now, what happens? How do you, a lot of times when we do our underwriting, right, we need to come up with a complete rent roll. What happens, or how do you adjust a rent roll when you've got vacancies in there?
That's another great question, Nitzan. So what you can do is apply a standard vacancy rate based on the historical financials at the property and also what's typical for the area. So especially for somebody new, one thing to be cognizant of is that if the property has 15% vacancy, but 5% is typical for similar assets in the area, you can't automatically start at that 5%, because the problem is that you're inheriting a property that's not going to be starting at 5%. So you need to account for the current position, and then you may be able to do better than that during your first year, but you don't want to account at the lower starting level because that's going to be an unrealistic starting point.
Right. Okay.
So
you have your rent roll and your T12, right? The
Yep.
actual numbers, not pro forma numbers, not made up numbers by the broker or anybody else.
Correct.
Okay. And then what's the next step? Now you've got the T12, you've got the rent roll. Where do you go from there?
So the next thing you would do is you would fill in your underwriting software. So depending on what you're using, there's a lot of different tools that are out there in the market at this point. So whichever one you're using, you want to take the information from the T12 and plug it into your underwriting tool. And the way that that's typically done is you're going to look at the income on a T3 annualized basis and the expenses on a T12 basis. And you might be wondering, why are we looking at them differently? And the simple answer is because that's generally how lenders do it. So we always want our underwriting to most closely resemble the way that a lender is going to look at it. So that way we don't have a big surprise when we submit our loan application and see they came up with a much different result than we did.
So say that again. So how do lenders underwrite? They take
the income on a
Right.
T3 annualized
T3.
basis. So what that means is we're taking the last 3 months and then we're
Of your income.
multiplying them by 4 to extrapolate that over the course of the year.
Mhm.
Whereas the expenses we're taking on the actual T12 basis. So whatever number is actually shown on the financial statement will be the number that we'll be using.
Okay.
So
Charles, I'm sorry. If anybody has any questions during this, just go right to the bottom, type in your questions, and either we'll get to them at the end of the webinar or we'll get to them as we go along. Go ahead, Charles. It's all you.
Sure. So what we'll do is we'll jump over to a sample T12 so you guys can see what one looks like. So now keep in mind, the reason this is called T12 is because it actually breaks it down month by month. So the way it differs from a P&L is that a P&L is going to take the total for all 12 months, and you'll really just see this column. So what happens, and we'll blow this up a little bit so it's easier to see. That may be a little bit easier. So you'll see that depending on the seller, there'll be a lot of different line items for both income and expenses. And the more sophisticated the seller, the more detailed the financials. So you'll see some sellers that are very simple and they do their accounting with only a handful of line items in each category. And then you'll see others that are very sophisticated and very detailed, and they'll literally have hundreds of line items that they have in their financials. So as we start going through them, aside from just the numbers themselves, because we do want the total numbers that we input into our underwriting tool, but we also want to train our eyes to look for things that jump out and that tell a story. So the numbers are going to tell us a little bit of the story, but what'll happen is they'll also give us things that we can go back and then question and ask the broker or ask the seller for more information. So anything that strikes us as unusual should be questioned. Now, from experience, what I would say is starting out, when you're first dealing with brokers or dealing with sellers, you probably don't want to hit them with 40 questions at once. And I'm speaking from experience. I have a running joke with one of the brokers I deal with regularly, because I jokingly say I only send him 5 to 10 questions now because he wasn't thrilled the first time I sent him a list of 40 questions. So the things that you want to train yourself to focus on are the things that are going to have the biggest impact on your deal. So what things will those be? So it's going to be, the ability of the property to have some type of value add component. So if there's an issue there, maybe there's an issue with physical occupancy, maybe there's an issue with delinquency. Can you correct those issues and add some type of value and increase the income through that? So you want to understand that. So one thing that jumps out to me before we even get into the actual underwriting, so you may notice here, so if I was just looking at a P&L, I would only have the total column here, which gives me something, but it doesn't give me the whole picture. But as we come into the physical vacancy line item, one of the things we can see here is earlier in the year in April, we're in the low to mid $40,000 range. Then all of a sudden it really spikes in June and July. We're at 55,000 and 61,000. And now here we are by November dropping to 18,000. So all of those numbers are part of the total number of 405,000. But there's a bigger picture here because something's happening that's causing the vacancy to spike as we approach the summer and then to decrease as we approach the fall. So we need to understand what's happening with that. And the most important thing we need to understand is this an issue that we can fix? Because if it's an issue we can't fix, then we have two options. Either one, make sure that we're able to deal with it, or two, walk away from the deal and find the next one.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to understand what these numbers are telling us and why it spiked in these months and why it declined here. So what's the bigger picture? And that's something the numbers won't tell us, but it gives us insight that we can go back to the broker or to the seller and ask for that information on. Okay, so now what we'll do is on our income. So on this particular T12, you'll notice they have a few different categories. There are some headings up top. They have one up here for rent, one up here for other income, which are generally your major income line items. And rent is going to be any type of rental income or rental loss income. So rental loss may be a new term for some of you. So that's going to encompass both physical and economic vacancy. Physical vacancy is when somebody's not in the unit. So if you have a unit that is unoccupied and with the standard turn, it can be made rent ready, then that would be physical vacancy. Economic vacancy can be a lot of different things. It could be having a tenant in a unit that's not paying. So what happens is you're unable to rent that unit out because it technically is occupied. Unfortunately, you're just not getting paid for it. It could be, if you have a larger property, it could be a unit that's used as a leasing office. It could be a unit that's used as a model unit. It could be a unit that you give a free unit to an employee that's on the property, or even a discounted unit. So those are all examples of economic vacancy. Other types of economic vacancy could be delinquency and bad debt, which right now during the time period that we're in, most properties, especially C assets that many of us look at, do tend to have a lot of bad debt because it's just the way we've been over the last year. There's been a lot of hardship, a lot of hurt, and a lot of people that have just not paid for different reasons. So that's something we have to look for as well. It could also be loss to lease. So loss to lease is the difference between what you're renting a unit for currently versus what a lease for that same floor plan is signed at. So if I'm renting a 1-bedroom, 1-bath unit that's 800 square feet for $750, and that's what my current rent is, that would be the market rent. But if I have a lease for that same floor plan that's signed at 700, then I would have a $50 loss to lease. So those are all different forms of economic vacancy. And those are things that we also want to understand and we want to look for. Other income can really refer to any type of income that's received that's not either rent or rental loss income. So it could be pet income, they could be application fees, they could be late fees, could be parking rent, it could be garage rent. There's all different types. There are definitely some that are more common than others, but then you'll see some sellers and some properties, they're very creative with the sources of income they bring in. So probably the largest source of other income you'll see at many properties is some type of utility reimbursement income. Some people do what's called a RUBS program. Some people actually have sub-meters installed in the property where they're billing back tenants for direct usage or whatever they use. And then other times you'll see landlords billing back a flat rate. That'll vary based on the area that you're in and the individual seller, because everybody does things a little bit differently. So let's come over to the right side. What we'll do on this T12 is we're going to go to the bottom of our income section and we'll take our last 3 months. So this particular T12 goes from April 2020 to March 2021. So our last 3 months here are going to be January, February, March of 2021. And what we'll do is we'll come over and extend this column so it's a little bit bigger. And we're in Excel. So the great thing is we can take the information very easily. And what we can do is make sure that we're taking the last 3 months. And what we do is we multiply them by 4. So when we say T3 annualized, this is what it means. So we're taking our last 3 months, January, February, March, and that's the subtotal. Then we multiply that by 4 to give us an annualized total. So we'll take the same formula and we'll just extrapolate it all the way down through the rest of the income items. Okay, so now what we'll do, and I'm going to apologize in advance because we may have some switching back and forth between the T12 and the underwriting tools, so don't get too confused. So we'll run through quickly on the underwriting tool we're going to be using, what the items we have to enter are. So we have gross potential income, vacancy, which refers to physical vacancy, concessions, loss to lease, and bad debt. That's going to refer to any type of economic vacancy. Other income. So we're only going to fill in the items that are in blue. The items that are in black will have formulas in them, so we won't touch those during today's session. Okay, so now we'll come over to our T12. What I normally recommend people do is once you start using an underwriting tool, you generally get pretty familiar with it. But every T12 is going to be a little bit unique. So to make sure that you don't miss anything on the T12, I would recommend starting with the T12 and going line item by line item. So that way you can enter them into your tool, being more familiar with that in whatever order you see fit. So the first item we're looking for is gross potential income. So on the T12, the item that's going to fall into that will be this top one here that's called rent potential. And that's one of the things we were saying where you may see different names. So whether it's gross potential rent, gross potential income, sometimes you'll see market rent. Generally, they all mean the same thing. There may be some slight differences, but what I often tell people to do is also look for the position that they're in on the financials. So almost always your top line item will be your gross potential income. So in this case here, our total is $4,198,695. So we'll take that and we'll plug it into our underwriting tool. Now, this particular property is 240 units, so we'll fill this in just so we have some context here. And the next thing we have is physical vacancy. So as we look at the line items on the T12, physical vacancy is intended to be this one here that says vacancy. So our total here is 313,034.96. Okay, so we have a vacancy rate that's just shy of 7.5%. Most times, if you're less than 10%, it's considered to be, within reason. Depending on the market you're in, you can definitely do better than that, and also how well you run your property. It's not uncommon for properties to be consistently 95% occupied in strong areas. Okay, so the next thing we have is concessions, loss to lease, bad debt, and that's going to encompass any type of economic vacancy. So on this particular T12, these highlighted items, concessions, delinquency, and collection for the property and collection agency, will be the items we're going to be using. So we'll take our total number here, and it's $5,918.56, and we'll plug that into our underwriting tool. So in this case, they have a very minimal amount of economic vacancy. And some of you might be wondering why. Is it realistic to run a 240 unit property at this amount of economic vacancy? So the answer to the question is most likely not. You might be able to for a short time, but it's very unlikely you'll be able to for a long time. But one of the things you'll notice as you start looking at more financials is that most times with this top line item for gross potential income, this number is usually pretty consistent throughout the course of the year. You may see one or two changes, but what this number represents is if all of your units were 100% occupied and they were rented at whatever you're charging today for those floor plans, this would be what your rent is. Most times you're not going to see that number fluctuate from month to month. It may fluctuate once or twice a year, depending on how frequently you increase rent, but you'll usually see a lot of consistency. So what happens here is you'll notice on this set of financials, we're starting at 340, and then we're seeing gradual increases and gradual fluctuations each month. So as that happens, what it's really telling us is this seller, even though they do show separate line items for vacancy and concessions, loss to lease, bad debt, they have some of that economic vacancy already baked in here. So the number here that says effective gross income, in actuality, while this number is correct, this number here is probably lower than what their gross potential income really is. But it's just how the seller does their accounting, and everybody does their accounting a little bit differently. So you'll see that.
Hey, Charles.
Yep.
Can you go over again how you calculate effective vacancy?
Absolutely. So when you're looking at the effective vacancy, so let's pull up a rent roll, and what we can do is we can go through a practical example. So your easiest way is you'll take your market rent. So most rent rolls will typically have a section that will say market rent, and they'll usually say effective rent. Now with this particular one here, it looks like it has market plus additional. So that may be factoring any type of additional charge they have on top of the rent also. But what we'll do is we'll come to the very bottom where they total it up for us. In this case, it's $360, $150. And keep in mind the number on here is different than what you'll see on the T12 because this is the most current information at the property. So let's pull up our calculator and we'll take a look. So what we're doing here is they have a column right next to it. I believe that's going to show us, okay, let's see, they may have something with vacancy here. So in this particular one, they don't, but they do have the items listed. So what we can do is we would total up all of the vacant units and we would figure out what the total number is for those units. So for simplicity, we'll just make up a number for right now to go through the example. So let's say if we had $36,000 from the current rent roll as physical vacancy, what we would do is take that number and we would divide it by the total number of gross potential income on the rent roll. So in this case, and just multiply that by 100, we would get 9.99 as our physical vacancy. And that, again, that's just a high level example. Will be a little bit different, but the numbers may not always be quite that clean. But same process and same formula. Okay, so then next thing we're looking for is other income. So with this particular property, one of the things we can see from all of the different line items is that they have a lot of sources of other income. And they have different things from month-to-month fees, which oftentimes you'll see landlords charge more money for short-term leases. So for the benefit of the tenant not having a 12-month or a 6-month term, what's happening is they may be able to do month-to-month, but that presents a greater risk for the landlord. So because of that, most landlords usually charge some type of premium. It could be $50, it could be $100, but it's some type of fee that they're putting on top, and that's one source of income. Another one here is pet rent. So for anybody that has a dog or a cat, they typically get charged some type of fee. Depending on the property and the area that you're in, it'll probably be somewhere between 15 and $35 per pet. And same thing here with this one here, bundled internet and cable. So these are all different fees you can collect, and you'll notice this one's particularly sizable. So in most cases, this here would probably be worth questioning because we're starting the year at $3,500 a month, and we're ending the year at $21,000 a month. Now, the reason for that is because this particular seller signed the contract in August of 2019. So this was still a fairly new contract. So what was happening is when you have a lease in place, you can't change the terms of the lease midway through. So you have to wait for that lease to expire. And then when the lease renews or a new tenant signs a new lease, you can have new terms. And at that point, now it's a requirement for the tenants to accept the bulk cable and internet package and to pay some type of fee for that. So that's why the income is increasing steadily throughout the year. So in this case, instead of focusing on all the individual line items, we'll come over and take our total number and we'll plug this into our other income. So some of you may notice that there are totals at the bottom. You might be wondering why I'm checking the numbers anyway. The reason I do that is because people make mistakes. Never assume that somebody's numbers are right. My general philosophy is always assume they're wrong until proven otherwise.
Right. As us New Yorkers, what do we say? Trust but verify.
Right. 100%. So in this case here, the number 616-202-52 does match up, but we always want to check that just to be certain. Okay, so that we'll plug that number into our underwriting tool, 616-202-52. And even double check our own numbers because we make mistakes. So you never want to assume that your numbers are right. So in this case here, it's telling us our total net income is $4,496,214. So let's check that against what we're seeing here. And what we're seeing here is a different number. So let's see, we may have a slight mistake there. So let's see, it looks like we do. Probably a transposition. Sometimes the swipe of a key the wrong way can make a big difference. Let's just take a quick peek and we'll see if we can figure it out so we get that corrected.
That's 5918.
Okay, so what it is, it's actually a transposition. So this number here should have been entered as 695. And that's why we always double check our numbers, because even when you do this long enough, you still make mistakes. So we want to make sure again that our number is good. So we are 4,495,944. And that's what we show in the T12. So now our number proves out. So for anybody who's ever done any type of accounting or bookkeeping, same philosophy with that as with this. You want to make sure that your numbers match up so there's no discrepancy.
Charles, before we continue,
Yep.
there's still another question about effective vacancy.
Yep.
So they're asking, effective vacancy should be the units with tenants that are not paying rent in addition to the physical vacancy?
Yeah. So essentially when you're saying effective vacancy, that would be combining both physical and economic. So that would be the case of both units that are actually vacant and units that do have bodies in there that just aren't paying.
Right. Any unit that is not producing income, whether it has somebody in it or not.
Correct. Okay, so then on the expense side, and you'll see a little more variation depending on the underwriting tool that you're using in the expenses, but most generally have similar categories. So here we have advertising, contract services, gas and electric, general admin, insurance, legal, real estate tax, trash removal, management fee, payroll, repairs and maintenance, turnover, water, sewer, and replacement reserve. So a couple of quick notes before we get into the actual numbers. So
Charles, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I just have another question on effective on the other income.
Sure.
Right. So when we're buying a property and we're looking at other income, do we have to look at also, sometimes one owner owner operator aren't that great at collecting. So they have a lot of late fees. They have a lot of, you know, extra charges because they're not good at collecting. Now, when you're taking over, you're going to be doing an awesome job at collections and putting in residents that will pay on time. So that may shift, right? That other income may adjust later on. How do you, what are your thoughts on that?
It's a good question, Itzan. So there's probably different ways to handle it, but most times what I would think is that the other income, usually I leave pretty similar unless there's a major line item in there. So for late fees, what I would find is that if you're looking at a C property, for better or worse, late fees do tend to probably be more common than any of us would like. What happens is, for different reasons, even if tenants do qualify, they may not have a lot of excess income. So they may have enough income to qualify to get into a unit, but not enough to pay all of the rent by the first. So if they get paid twice a month, you may get half the rent each paycheck.
Right.
So that may come with a late fee each month, and then you'll have that income as consistent. What I would say is if you had a large one-time line item, like maybe you just signed a new bulk cable and internet contract and you got some type of one-time payout, and sometimes those can be sizable depending on the property you're at. They can be 20, 30, 40, $50,000. That's income that's not likely to repeat. So what I would recommend is that you isolate that and you don't include that in your underwriting, because that's something that's not going to be repetitive. So if it's something that they've had consistently over the previous period of that you're looking at in the financials, and it's a line item that's likely to continue, I would include it. But anything that's one time and large and unlikely to repeat, make sure to exclude.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so on the expense side, what we'll do is we'll start going through the different line items. So similar to the income, they'll have them dividing into different categories. So the first one here is payroll. Now, what I would normally recommend, you usually want to go through these items anyway, a quick glance, just to make sure they're in the right categories. So different sellers categorize things differently. Just keep that in mind. So the way that we generally would do things, advertising is fairly straightforward. That's any of the advertising or marketing costs you're going to have to develop a wait list of tenants or to fill vacant units. So that's going to be apartments.com. It's going to be Zillow. It's going to be any marketing that you do that gets eyeballs on the property. It could be signage, but anything that you're doing to get attention or eyeballs on the property. Contract services. So sometimes there's confusion over what a contract service is versus a repair and maintenance item. So a contract service is something that's going to be repetitive, and it's usually on some type of scheduled frequency. It could be monthly, it could be quarterly, and usually at some type of fairly similar level of pricing. So your most common levels, your most common items of contract services are landscaping, pest control. If you're in an area that has snow removal, that's usually in there as well. And depending on the underwriting tool you're using, sometimes trash removal could be categorized in there. Sometimes it's categorized as a utility. In this particular case, we actually have a separate line item, so that'll be totally separate. But those are your most common ones. Whereas repair and maintenance is typically a one-time item. So let's say you have a tenant, they put a work order in, and they're saying that they have a leak in the ceiling of their bathroom, and you need to get your in-house maintenance team to go in there and look at it. So that's a repair and maintenance item because it's isolated and it's a one-time thing. Even if you had a bigger item, maybe you need to spend $2,000 to fix a plumbing issue and you bring an outside contractor in, that's still repair and maintenance because it's a one-time item. But let's say that you had some type of consistency and you have a swimming pool at the property, and every month you're spending $300 because you have a vendor that comes in and they put chemicals in the pool and they make sure that it's safe for people to use. So that would be a contract service because there's consistency in both frequency and cost. Okay, so general admin, that's going to encompass anything that's typically used to run your leasing office. Even if you have a smaller property and you're running it with offsite management, there's probably still some type of office expenses, but any type of administrative expense. So this could be tenant background checks. That's a general and admin expense. Depending on the underwriting tool you're using, oftentimes professional fees are included. This one here breaks out legal, but many include a right in general admin. So any type of permit or license, that would be general admin, any type of bank fees, any type of expense that's associated with the administrative running of the property would typically fall into this category. Insurance,
Paper clips and ink for your printer as well.
right? Absolutely. Insurance, this one's pretty straightforward. So this is going to cover all of the different insurances that you have for the property. Now the key words there are for the property, because you will oftentimes see workers' compensation insurance on different financials as well. That's actually a payroll line item because that's not really for the property, that's for the employees. So that's a little bit different, but any type of general liability insurance, any type of property insurance, any type of umbrella policy you might have, along with any flood insurance or specialties that your lender might require, those are insurance that would fall into this category.
Mm-hmm.
Real estate taxes, that one's also pretty straightforward. Whether we like it or not, real estate taxes are usually a pretty big line item. So we want to make sure to account for them. Now, one thing that's really important with this particular underwriting tool, you'll notice there's different scenarios we can play with. So the one that we're using now is based on the seller's numbers, the way they're running the property. Then with these other scenarios, we can adjust them to the way that we see ourselves being able to run the property. One thing that's really important is real estate taxes, because oftentimes I've seen them increase so much where they can actually kill the deal solely by themselves. And what's important to understand is that each area handles taxing differently. So it's very important to reach out to the assessor in the area or county that you're looking for property in, and make sure you understand when they're going to reassess and how they're going to calculate the reassessment, and whether or not a sale is going to trigger an automatic reassessment. And the reason that's important is because it'll determine how soon you get hit with the increase. At some point, you will get hit with the increase. That's a definite. The question more so is when. So some states are what they call point of sale states, which means that when you sell a property, the assessor in the county where the property is located gets notified of the sale. And let's say if they're on a 5-year reassessment schedule, but they're only in year 1 of that 5-year period, then they're automatically going to reassess you the next year if you're in a point of sale state. And the reason that's important is because your tax bill may increase astronomically. So you really want to make sure you understand that. So for me, I look at properties in different states, but some of the more common ones I'm in are North Carolina and South Carolina. So North Carolina is not a point of sale state. Most counties reassess on a 4-year schedule. Some do on an 8-year schedule, but it's important to reach out to the assessor in whatever county you're looking in and make sure you really understand that, because that can be a big difference maker in your deals. Then South Carolina, in contrast, is a point of sale state. So South Carolina is going to reassess automatically when a sale happens, regardless of where they are in their reassessment cycle. And they're going to hit you with that higher bill immediately. So you want to make sure you account for that and you have that time frame and that amount in there properly.
How do you find out, Charles, how much the assessment is going to go up? What is the increase? How do you find that out?
So the easiest way that I usually recommend is reaching out directly to the assessor in the county. Now, most counties have usually 1 or 2 people that handle commercial real estate, whereas most of their people are relatively unfamiliar with it and just do individual homes and residential. So you'll want to make sure that whenever you reach out to them, you find out who deals with commercial real estate in their office, and you want to speak to that person or people. Generally, I usually do it by email. I would recommend starting by that. And the reason I do that is because that way you get it in writing, and that way there's no discrepancy. So for me, one of the things I always like to do by email as well is after they give me the answers to those questions of when it's going to be reassessed and how it's going to be calculated, I like to go back with the sample equation. And I say, okay, if they told me that they're going to take the purchase price, so I'll say, let's say the purchase price is X, which in this case we'll say X is $1 million, and that they multiply that by 6% to get the assessed value. So then in that case, we would take $1 million and multiply it by 6%. So that case would be 60,000. And then they would multiply that by whatever the millage rate is. So I would take whatever equation they give me, and I would just break it down into a written format and say, would it look something like this? And if not, can you correct whatever I did wrong? Most times they're willing to do that. The good news is, with a lot of the counties, most times they can be pretty helpful with that. Although I will tell you, the larger the county, the less helpful they get. So that's generally the best way to do it, though, and to figure that out. Okay, so the other items we have here, trash removal is pretty self-explanatory. That's going to be any cost you have for sanitation pickup. It could also include any dumpsters you might have at the property or any type of sanitation expense in general. Management fee, this is intended to be property management. So there's two different types of management. There's property management and there's asset management. Property management is day-to-day operation at the property level. And that's going to be, excuse me, that's going to be leasing. It's going to be collections. It's going to be dispatching work orders and getting them handled. So it will be any items with the day-to-day operation of the property. Asset management is managing the property manager. So the asset manager's job is to steer the ship. The property manager's job is to execute the asset manager's plan. And for this example, this is only property management. Most times, asset management will appear as a below the line expense. So as we come down here and we look at our net operating income, this isn't our final number. This is the number that's typically used to impact our sales price, because that's what's going to be used in the formula to calculate that. But unfortunately, this is not the number we're distributing to our investors. So there are what's called above the line and below the line expenses. Above the line is referred to as anything that's included in your net operating income. Below the line is anything that's not included in that. So asset management would typically fall as a below the line expense. Okay, so payroll is going to be for any payroll item. That's going to be the wages that you pay the staff. It'll be the benefits that you give them. It'll be the tax burden. It'll be anything else like workers' comp insurance. Those are all payroll items that you have to account for. Okay, so the next two, repair and maintenance and turnover. So you might be wondering, what's the difference between one versus the other? So repair and maintenance is a one-time repair. So if you're replacing an appliance or repairing an appliance, if you're going in and fixing a leak, those are one-time items. Turnover is when a unit becomes vacant, and it's the normal cost associated with getting that unit rent ready for the next tenant. So painting, when the unit is vacant, that is a turnover expense. Cleaning, that's a turnover expense. Some type of minor repairs, because unfortunately, none of our tenants are perfect. So there's always some type of repair when you have a unit that becomes vacant. So they may have put a little nick in the cabinetry. There may be, a part of the flooring that's not in perfect condition. So those are things that are turn expenses, because when the new tenant walks in there, you want that unit to look good as new. And to do that, there are expenses associated. So that's what turnover is. And then water sewer, also pretty self-explanatory. That's just the utility expense. Okay, so as we run through the expenses on the T12, so we're looking at payroll here, and we have these different line items that are highlighted.
Hey,
Now,
Charles, I'm sorry to interrupt again.
Yep.
I guess that's kind of my job, right?
Yep.
What is human directional?
That's a great question.
I personally have never seen that. Is that the guy with the sign outside that does all the flipping and hey, come to me, check me out? What is that?
It's a great question, and I don't have a good answer to that, because there are some things that we won't get from the financials, unfortunately. But that would kind of be my thought as well, that perhaps maybe they have a guy standing outside with a sign or a billboard on his chest.
Right?
But it's an interesting name. I like that.
Human directional. That's great.
These guys here, I guess, are running a bigger property than I am at this point, so I'll have to learn from them with it. But it's a unique name.
Absolutely.
So for purposes of this example, we're going to assume that's a payroll item, because I have no idea what human directional actually is. Now, keep in mind, as we're doing our underwriting, so while it is important to put things in the right spot, it's more important to account for them somewhere. So if you're brand new and you don't know what you're doing, and you don't know if these are payroll items or not, just make sure you put the expense in there. So the initial thing is that it's very important to account for everything, so we get it into our underwriting tool and it factors into our numbers. We could always readjust the category afterward if you find that it belongs in a different category. Okay, so in this case, we'll take these payroll expenses, and our total number is 211, 806, $1,000,000.53. And with the underwriting tool, it also breaks down what the expense is per unit. So it takes the total number of units we have and divides it by that expense to calculate that. So the next category we have here is tax and benefit. So this is also a payroll item. So this would be what they typically refer to as benefit and burden. So these items here we'll put into our payroll expense as well. And our number here is 62,543.45. Okay, so then as we go down to T12, we'll keep working our way through. So the next item we have here in the administrative expense section. So we want to run through these items and see if there's anything that doesn't belong.
Hey, Charles,
So-
quick question. I'm sorry, before you continue with the administrative expenses,
Yep.
why are we doing this? Why are we transferring these numbers from this T12 onto our underwriting?
Neat sound, great question. So the reason we're doing that is to assess the financial viability of the deal.
Okay.
So every deal, we want to match up and see what type of return it's going to give us and our investors. So what will happen here is there's a couple of key metrics we're going to look at. The ones that we generally focus on cash return, because that's the indication of our cash flow. Debt coverage ratio, which is the amount of cash flow that the property throws off to service the mortgage. And what I would tell you is, while the debt coverage ratio doesn't mean as much to the investors because it doesn't really go in their pocket, I would even say that from a standpoint of safety, this is probably the most important one, just for the fact that you want to make sure your mortgage is paid.
That's right.
Okay, so then we have average annual return. That's a very important metric that many investors use. And IRR, internal rate of return. So those are the ones that we generally focus on. And the reason we put them in our underwriting tool is to figure out what those metrics are.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. So in this particular section, they do have one line item that says eviction and legal fees. So what we'll do is we'll break that out just to put it in separately. Now, if you're using an underwriting tool that does not have a separate line item for legal, you could plug that right into general admin, because that's where many of them would put it. But for here, we'll break it apart being they have one. And then the rest of these line items will plug into general admin. So we have 112, 289.95. Now, one thing that's a particularly large expense on this property, which you'll notice, is the cable and internet billing. And that's because they have a bulk agreement at this property. So what happens is, instead of just paying for cable and internet service for the office and for the common area, they're actually paying for all the apartments. And the way that those agreements are typically structured is you have a set fee with the cable company, and you have to pay them X amount of dollars every month based on the number of units you have at the property. And then you're able to take that service and essentially resell it to your tenants. So that's the reason it's so abnormally large at this property. Okay, so the next section we have is classified as advertising and marketing. Similar to human directional up top, we have human signage down here, so perhaps they go hand in hand. But these items all do appear to be marketing and advertising. So we'll plug these into our advertising section. That's 72,233.07. Okay, next item here, travel and entertainment. While this is a fairly common accounting expense, it's definitely not as common on a lot of multifamily properties. So in this case here, they have almost $9,000 of travel and entertainment. So we'll lump that into general admin, and that's 8890.72. Now, one thing I would say right off the bat is that for most of us taking over this property, we're probably not going to have that $9,000 in expenses. So that's something we can save on right away. So next thing we have is repair and maintenance. So similar to the categories above, we'll just quickly examine and see if these line items fall into the category. And from quick glance, they do. So initially, again, keep in mind, you may not know which items fall into which category. So just make sure you put the numbers somewhere. You can always adjust it to the right category after. The last thing you want to do is leave it out and then not have that number in and think that you have a better deal than you do.
Right.
Okay, so this number here for repair and maintenance is $18,007.98. So we'll plug that in. Okay, so the next category we have here is contract services and replacement. So now this one here may get a little bit trickier. So you'll see all of these items, and they have them classified as contract services, which I would argue that a good number of them actually aren't. Extermination, we'll put that as a contract service. Now, you'll notice most months it's consistent somewhere between 160 and 260 bucks, but then we definitely have a few months where it jumps. And this may be worth asking a question just to understand what happened here. Was there some type of infestation that they had to fumigate? Just so you understand what the issue was. But generally, extermination will be a contract service. Same thing's going to apply for monthly landscaping. You'll notice every month, this amount is consistent all throughout the year. It's the same amount all 12 months. That is the exact definition of a contract service. Some of the other items here, security and safety, you'll notice just sporadic expenses throughout the year. There is some consistency in the $10 to $15 range and then a jump. I would probably say that's more likely to be either repair and maintenance or potentially even general admin. There are some things that'll be in a gray area depending on what they are. And strictly on the financials, we won't be able to tell. So for purposes of this segment, we're going to put it in repair and maintenance. Same thing with fire inspection and safety. There is some consistency to being expenditures, but there's really 2 months where the bulk of that expenditure is concentrated. 1 month where it's $1,500, another month where it's $1,700. So that's really the bulk of that expenditure, and that's probably more a repair and maintenance item. Annual fire.
The best thing to do would be to put these on the side once you're done underwriting or during that process, and reach back out to the broker and say, hey,
Yep.
I have some questions about these numbers here.
Right. Absolutely. So annual fire and safety inspection. So this one you could actually make a case would be a contract service. Even though the amount's a little bit higher in the first 2 months, it's consistent. And then throughout the last 10 months of the year, it is the same amount. So we can say that that's a contract service and include that also. Backflow testing. In most areas, this is a once a year item, and that's all it is here. So that's really more of a repair and maintenance item. There's no consistency and no frequency. So that's going to be repair and maintenance. And same thing with cleaning common. It's a one-time expense of $24.
Pretty cheap.
Now, yep. Okay, so we'll take our totals here. So extermination will plug into contract services. That's $42.93.80. And then we'll take the total of our next item, security and safety, put that as repair and maintenance, $129.84. And the contract service, we'll put fire inspection and safety. This is going to be repair and maintenance item, $52.71.26. Next one here is annual fire and safety inspection. That's $4,008. So we'll put that as a contract service because that one seems to be pretty consistent month after month. Backflow testing and cleaning common. We'll take a total here of $324.70, and we'll plug that into repair and maintenance. Landscaping, this one's definitely a contract service. That's $38,460. And then the last one we have here is pool supply and maintenance. So with this particular property, I would put it more repair and maintenance, but there are some properties where you will see consistency in the pool maintenance every single month. And in that case, I'd probably put it as more of a contract service. But this one, we only have it a few times throughout the year. The amounts do fluctuate a bit, so I wouldn't quite call it as consistent. Okay, so that'll be $1528.24, and that's going to be repair and maintenance. Okay, so the next item here, some sellers will actually designate which items are turnover or make ready. So that makes it a lot easier for us so we don't have to guess. And in this case, they're designating each of these items here as turnover expenses. So we can take the total of these and plug them into turnover. and it's $4,388.20. Now, my first thought is, for anybody running a 240 unit property, spending $4,000 a year on turnover, they must be doing something stupendous, because I can't figure out that. But that is quite an accomplishment. Okay,
Yeah,
so
right. That's a little bit on the low side. So you might want to ask that question as well.
right, that's definitely a good question. So one thing you'll notice as we go through these expenses is there are general rules of thumb that we can typically use. And those rules of thumb are going to vary from market to market. So they'll be different in New York than they will in North Carolina. They'll be different in North Carolina than they will in Alabama, and they'll be different in Alabama than they will in Washington. So whatever market you're looking in, you'll want to get familiar with what's typical for that market. Okay, so now we have utilities. So some underwriting tools put all the utilities in one category. This particular one does break them apart separately, so we'll do the same thing. So we have electric for the common area and electric for the vacant units. So we'll plug that in as $40,842.42. And then our next line item is water. That's $113,017.09. As a general rule of thumb, what I would tell anybody in here, depending on the age of the property, if it's something that's built before 2000, I would usually say your biggest expenses, your three biggest expenses will always be real estate tax, payroll, and utilities. And most times water sewer is typically your largest utility by far. For things built after 2000, you may start to see repair and maintenance and turnover past utilities, because a lot of those have more energy efficient appliances, and they have a lot of things that are in place to lower the energy bills. And many of them are even sub-metered, because that's become a lot more common within the last 2 decades. Okay, so utility connection fees. So it's hard to tell exactly what that is from this line item, but it may have something to do with connecting or disconnecting service when a tenant moves out of a unit. So for now, being we don't really know what that is, I'm going to assume that's some type of administrative expense. So we'll plug that into general admin, and that's $2297.36. And the last line item in that category is trash removal. So that one's going to go right into our trash removal category. That's $21,212.42. Okay, so we're near the end of the seller's financials. We're coming down here now to taxes and insurance. And this one might hurt my heart just a little bit. We'll take these top 2 line items that are tax items, and we're going to have 646, 31106. So keep in mind, this is why it's very important to understand the taxes. On this property alone, $2,600 a unit and an astronomical percentage of the income. North Carolina is not a point to sale state, but even with the seller's tax bill, astronomical. So you really want to make sure you understand that, because taxes can absolutely kill a deal. There are deals I've had that would work otherwise, and I've seen it where the taxes would double, sometimes even triple upon sale. If you've had a seller that's owned the property for a very long time, and all of a sudden you get a much higher sale price, that could greatly inflate the assessment you have. Okay, so then we have insurance. They're at 36, 135.13. So as you're first starting out, you'll want to greatly rely on your property manager to know what's typical in an area. Once you look in an area and you've looked at a couple of deals and you have some confidence in your ability to pick good numbers, then you'll get a sense for where things typically run. One thing that I know from looking at this is that even though I'd love to say that we can run it at $150 a unit on the insurance side, I would say the odds are probably slim. So is it possible the seller's running it at that number? Absolutely. So what could be the reason for something like that? So it could be maybe they're a very large operator and they have the benefit of having a large portfolio package policy where they're getting a discounted value. It could be that maybe they have the property underinsured. Not a good thing, but there are definitely sellers that do that. So especially as syndicators, we don't want to do that. We want to make sure we have good coverage so that way our investors are protected and we're protected. So different things you'll notice as you start to go through enough sets of financials. So now we're into professional fees. So management fee, this is our property management fee. This is 102,945.42. And with the remaining items here, accounting fee, utility fee, internet transaction, all the way down to licenses and fees. These are general administrative items. So we're going to put them right in that category. And that's 47,848.45. Okay, so on the replacement reserve, temporarily, we're just going to take this out, and I'll explain why in just a minute. And we'll make sure that our expenses match up to what we see on the T12. So we have 1,558,943. And the same way we did with our income, we want to check our expenses. So this line item here is total operating expenses, and we have 1,558,943. So that matches up. So some of you might be wondering why I temporarily took the replacement reserve out. The reason why is because this is really what they refer to as a below the line expense. This particular underwriting tool does account for it above the line, but most sellers and most financials do put it below the line. So because of that, I temporarily took that number out of the equation.
Can you explain real quick what you mean by above the line and below the
Absolutely.
line?
So above the line is something that gets calculated as part of your net operating income and ultimately affects your purchase price and your sale price. Whereas it's below the line, it does not affect your net operating income and does not affect your purchase or sale price, but it will affect the amount of cash flow that you have available to distribute to your investors. So this is the underwriting based on the T12 that we saw. Now, the question is what's next? Because it's great that we put the numbers into our underwriting tool, but what does that actually do for us? So at this point, it's really just a starting point. Now, the next thing we need is to figure out what price the deal works at for us. So there's a couple of different components of it. To me, what I usually do is I start with the broker, and most deals will have pricing guidance or a whisper price. And what that means is that the price isn't set in stone. It's not quite an asking price, but based on the comps in the area and what the seller has probably told the broker that they're hoping to get for it, the broker has a general range that they're trying to target the sales to be in. So we can use that as a starting point. Keep in mind, we are in a seller's market in most areas throughout the country. So we're not always going to be able to pay their numbers. I would venture to say most times we're not going to be able to. So don't overpay for something just because the broker tells you that's where it needs to be. But we're going to use that as a starting point and then see how close we can get to it. So with this particular deal right now, we don't have pricing guidance yet, but at the bottom of this tool, what it does is it takes the net operating income and applies different cap rates to show us what the values would be. Now, this property is located in the Research Triangle, which is one of the more desirable sections of North Carolina. So while I'd love to say that we'd be able to buy it a 6 or a 6.5 or a 7 cap, it's probably very unlikely. This is a 2000 built property, 240 units. So probably more realistic. I would think we'll probably be somewhere in the 4 or 5 range, even though 6 or 7 sounds a lot better.
Right.
Yeah.
But you know, we should let people know that, you know, cap rates, they're not the end all be all metric of whether this is a good deal or not, right?
Right.
It's just a ratio and to tell you where your income is versus your purchase price. It doesn't tell you if this is a good deal or not.
Yep. You know, so keep in mind, for anybody out there, most of us buying these deals are using mortgages. There are very few of us that have enough money to buy properties this size all cash. So if you're buying it all cash, then cap rate is a great metric.
Right.
But if you're using a mortgage, cap rate's only a very small piece of the equation.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the cap rate for me personally, what I do is I use it to see if I'm paying in the right range for that property. So if I'm looking at a C asset in Charlotte, and those properties are trading in the low 5 cap rate range typically, and I'm paying a 3 cap, then I know I'm probably overpaying for it. If I'm paying a 7 cap, then I probably got a good deal, or there's something I'm not aware of. And if I'm paying in that 5 range, then I know that I'm in the right ballpark because that's what similar assets are selling for in that marketplace. So that's really, for me, what I find the best way to use cap rate. Now, for sake of this example, let's say we're buying at a 5.5 cap, which unfortunately may be even a little bit high for this area, but we'll use that for the example. And let's put our purchase price at 52 million, just so we have some context and we can see what it looks like.
And this is a 240 unit property, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. So 240 units built in 2011 in Charlotte, you said?
No, so this is in the Triangle in Chapel Hill, 2000
Okay.
build. So it's like a B, probably a B or a B plus asset.
Okay.
Nice area, very affluent demographics. So in an area like this, we're just going to do some guesstimating here, but keep in mind, aside from the underwriting, there's a few things that you need to follow up on. So the initial underwriting is really a starting point. What you need to do after that is follow up. And that's really where the real work in underwriting comes in. So the follow-up is getting back to the broker and asking questions. The follow-up is reaching out to the tax assessor in the county to understand how and when the taxes will be reassessed. It's getting an insurance quote for the property. It's getting a financing quote. So of those items, there's a good chance that financing is probably either your biggest or second biggest component. So you want to make sure that you have good information on that. As you start to get familiar with areas and deals, you can probably guesstimate and be fairly close on it, but especially starting out, make sure you get a quote and that you're getting good information so you're putting the right stuff into your underwriting tool. The underwriting tool is only as good as the information you give it.
That's right.
So in this area, I'll make an assumption that we can probably get 80% LTV. So that'll put us at a 20% down payment. Interest only will vary from lender to lender, but good chance you could probably get at least 2 years on this property. So let's be really conservative, put 1 year. And repairs. So when you see repairs appear, this is different from repairs and maintenance. This is CapEx. So CapEx is the work that you're budgeting for prior to acquiring the property. And it's work that's either going to improve the property or it's going to clean up some type of deferred maintenance. So if the parking lot has holes in it and it needs to be repainted, unfortunately, that's not going to add any real value to the property. Nobody's going to pay you extra rent because you repainted and resealed the parking lot. But generally, it's something that's expected. So you need to do that. And those are things that have to be done. So if there's an issue with that, you need to budget for it. If you're upgrading units, so that's what people are generally willing to pay for, and that will add to your bottom line. People will pay you an extra $100 or $200 a unit because you renovated the units. They're probably not going to pay you an extra $100 because you fixed the roof. So the ideal scenario is focusing on CapEx items that increase your income, but sometimes there are deferred maintenance items that you have to do anyway. So right now, let's just assume this is a sizable property. CapEx dollars can go a lot faster than you may realize. Let's assume that you're probably going to need a good $2 million. Now, this property is in good condition, but it's built 20 years ago. So what that means is it's probably not up to speed with the latest trends. It's not as outdated as something from the 70s or 80s, but there are still things that it has that are just not as unique and special as the property that's built in 2020. So if part of our plan is to upgrade the units, then we need to make sure we factor in enough money that we're able to execute that plan. So for now, we're just going with a high level number, but as you get into actually looking at deals and underwriting them, the first place you can gain that information is from the broker. Now, keep in mind, the broker is not a contractor. You should not take their number as gospel, but it's a starting point. So if the broker is proposing a particular scope of work, there's a good chance that they've done this enough that they may have some idea what that scope of work is going to cost, so they can give you a ballpark number. If you get the deal and you're looking at it during due diligence, then you certainly want to have your property manager or any contractors that you need to look at it. So that way you can get good numbers on those and then adjust your numbers as you need to. So an operating reserve, this is the money that sits in the account that's extra. And right now, especially after the last year that we've had, one of the things that I'm very big on, I know Nissan is as well, is that you cannot have enough operating reserves.
Right.
There was a lot of people who probably got put in some very bad situations in March and April and May of 2020. And granted, none of us could ever have quite predicted what would have happened, but it just echoes the importance of having operating reserves. You want to make sure that you have capital that's ready to deploy if you need to, and that you're able to use to run the property if you have a bad situation like that occur. So I normally recommend using 4 months of whatever our operating expenses are. Most times that's enough to keep us safe. And on top of the reserve that we're imposing, at least for the current time, many lenders are still imposing their own reserve. There is a chance that may go away in the future. So just keep abreast of the situation if it does. But for now, it's something we'll have to factor in as part of our equation. So in this case, for me, I usually factor in 4 months of the operating expenses. And most times for me, I usually use scenario 4 for my own numbers. So I just usually go from that column and I plug that in. Always make sure you have your numbers in. Okay. So
and just to harp on what you were saying as well, operating reserves, don't skimp out on the operating reserves. You can move it down a little bit and whatnot, but you really want to make sure that you have operating reserves because you never know what's going to happen. Like Charles said, we never knew that we were going to get shut down. We never knew that people weren't going to pay rent. You don't know what's going to happen, especially with what we just went through.
Yep.
Anything is possible.
That's the truth. Anything's an understatement.
Right. So
Yep.
it's better. A lot of times we say, yeah, but you know what? That money is just sitting in the bank account and I have to pay my investors their returns on top of it. It's better than losing the property. Better than foreclosing.
To further touch on that, one thing I would say, and a lot of the deals that I put out to people do have lower returns than other syndicators.
Mm-hmm.
And people will ask me about it. And they'll say, why do you show lower returns? And I said, I'm probably too conservative on certain things, but I'd rather be too conservative and show a lower return than ever have to go back to somebody and make a capital call.
Right.
The worst thing you can do as a syndicator is say, you know what? We didn't raise enough money.
That's right.
Yeah. So in that regard, it's always better to be safe than sorry is kind of the approach we usually take there. So as we go further down here, it also gives us some different options on the financing. So the down payment's obviously one portion. Another portion is the rate. So being that we're in a time where interest rates are at historic lows, the one good thing about that is we can get great rates. So on a deal this size in an area like this, I would use 3.3. I wouldn't even be surprised if you got less than that because I routinely see them in the low 3s at this point. So for an asset like this, nice area, a lender will look at that very favorably. They'll give you a good rate. And for whatever reason, most lenders prefer writing big checks than little checks. So if you're borrowing $40 million, you'll probably get a better rate than if you're borrowing $5 million. So that's usually the way it works. The amortization term that we usually see on most of the deals we're looking at, which are agency loans, are usually 30-year ones. If you choose to use bank financing for any reason, most of them are probably 20 or 25 years. So you'd want to adjust this to reflect that. But I would think many of us here are probably using agency debt because that is the preferred way that most multi and family investors usually focus on. So now for the sake of our example, let's also add in, there's a section here that says acquisition costs at the bottom. And there's an item here that says lender held funds. And then 2 items below it, real estate taxes and insurance. So we want to make sure we factor these items in. So lender held fund, that's what I usually use for the principal and interest reserve, otherwise known as the COVID reserve. So I come over to the P&L tab. We want to get the full amount of our debt service with principal and interest. In this case, it's $2,230,556. And we're going to divide that by 2, with the reason being that most lenders are only requiring 6 months principal and interest currently for deals this size. But still, we want to make sure we factor that in. Otherwise, we'll be $1 million short at closing, and nobody wants that. And then with taxes and insurance, what I would generally recommend is to take 1 year's worth of each, because what's going to happen at closing, you're going to have to pay your full year 1 insurance premium. And your lender is also going to take some money for taxes and for insurance to fund the escrow account. So they may not take a full year, but it's always better to be safe than sorry. And if worse comes to worse, you have extra money in your reserve. So in this case, the taxes, $646,311. So we're going to factor that amount in. And we'll also use the shell as insurance, but as you wind up getting your own quote, then you could adjust that to reflect the correct number. So 36,135. Now, between these 3 numbers, we're at nearly $1.8 million. So you don't want to forget to include those, because that's a lot of money you'll be short at closing otherwise. So now what we'll do is we'll come over for the sake of the example, and we'll look at our summary tab to see what type of return we're getting. So there's a couple of things we could adjust on here. One is going to be our acquisition fee. Depending on the size of the deal you're looking at, your acquisition fee is going to change. If you're looking at a $2 million deal, it might be on the 5% side of the purchase price. If you're looking at a $50 million deal, it might be 1%. So it's usually a sliding scale that typically ranges anywhere from 1 to 5% of the purchase price. Current market cap rate. So this is what deals are currently trading at. The reason this is important is because we always want to make sure we're projecting our terminal cap rate to be higher than our current cap rate. Unfortunately, none of us have a crystal ball, so we don't know where the market's going to be in 3, 4, 5 years. So we have no control over that. But still, you want to test it and put different scenarios in there, so that way we have an understanding of where things are. Now, what you'll notice is, aside from the purchase price, the terminal cap rate is the single biggest factor that can impact the return on your deal. Unfortunately, it's also the one we have the least control over. But it's a big mover. So aside from price, that's going to be your number 2 item that'll really impact your return. And then what we'll also do is we'll change the splits. So different groups operate with different splits. Most times in our deals, we're usually looking at a 70-30 split. If you're doing a preferred return, you can plug that in. Asset management fee, usually 1%, and 1% for capital transaction. So from a high level, as we look at the deal, and this is without any value add factored in, even though we do have CapEx in there. We're at a 3.4% cash on cash return. We're at a negative average annual return, and we're at a very strong debt coverage ratio. So from a standpoint of safety, as we look at our P&L tab, we can see that the debt coverage ratio in year 1 is great. That's because it's interest only. Not as great in the next couple of years. It's maybe safe, but probably not safe enough because it's borderline. So, that's concerning. And the cash on cash return, average annual return, and a negative IRR is not going to be attractive to anybody. So there's really a few options we would have on a deal like this. Option 1 is to change the purchase price. That's the biggest one. The downside to that is the more competitive the deal is, the less likely you are to win it. Because there's a lot of groups out there that are paying crazy prices, but sometimes losing a deal is not so bad, because it's better to lose a deal than to get one that you're totally overpaying for and wind up with a mess on your hands.
That's right.
So purchase price is 1. Second is adjusting on numbers. So is there something that we can change? Can we do something? Maybe can we run the expenses more efficiently than the seller did? So there's a lot of people that'll tell you to focus on the percentage of expenses to income. A lot of times I don't find that as relevant. I tend to look more at the expenses per unit, and I find that to be a better metric. So in the Carolinas, for a B asset, most times I would tell you could probably be in the 5,000 to 5,500 per unit expense range. But the key is we have to examine the line items and see what can we really change. So the biggest mover on this deal is taxes. And unfortunately, they're astronomical. So I'd love to say I could cut the tax bill in half, but I'm not that good. So that one's probably going to stay. And unfortunately, it'll probably even go up at some point. So we have to account for that. They're spending $300 a unit on advertising. So starting out, you may not know what's typical, but in a lot of areas, for a stabilized asset, $100 a unit is more than enough. If it's really high occupancy, maybe even $50. So $300 is probably on the high side. We could probably trim that a little.
Right. However, before you start trimming, really discuss with the broker, right? So something like, for example, what I found in my experience is that sometimes when I see a property that is, stabilized, but they have high advertising, it could be that they need to spend that money to maintain their high occupancy.
Right.
And if you drop your advertising budget by half, you may start losing occupancy because people aren't going to be coming to your property. So find out, again, before you start cutting numbers, always talk to the broker, find out, hey, why is marketing advertising so high? Especially today when you've got, free places to advertise, right? You got Facebook Marketplace, you got Craigslist, you got all these places. And then you've got apartments.com or rentpath.com that'll charge you maybe $500-600 a month to advertise your asset. You got Zillow, you got all these places. So really focus on why that number is what it is before you start slashing it.
Yep. So keep in mind, as we were saying before, the numbers are a starting point, but they only tell us part of the story. So
Right.
the other part is getting the words to go with it.
Mhm.
And that's where you go back to the broker, you go back to the seller, and you get whatever that information is so you can figure out. My favorite question, I always tell people, why?
Why?
I want to understand why it's happening. I see the numbers on the paper. I see what's happening, but why is it happening?
Right.
Because that's what gives us context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, and that'll let us know if it's something that we can change or something that we have to absorb and keep it the same.
Right.
So aside from that, the only other thing we have is to have some type of value add. So at this point, we don't know exactly what that value add is. One thing I would say is that in this particular tool, there's different scenarios, and on the underwriting up here, it's set to scenario 4. So the vacancy we're using is a bit higher than what the seller is showing. So let's say if we bring it, a little bit closer, we'll bring it to 10%, still a little higher, but within the same general ballpark. What does that do to our returns? So that alone brings us to a positive return, not a good return, but a positive return. So then at that point, with this $2 million in CapEx, we'd have to figure out, okay, where can we push rents to? So how do we do that? So there's different ways you can do it. Some people look on apartments.com. Some people use different online resources. And I think those are all great starting points. Perhaps I'm a bit old fashioned in my approach, but I always say, you know what? I call the property manager. I like to know, where can these units go? What are you seeing in your portfolio in that area today? Call some of the comp properties, call as a prospective tenant and say, look, I'm looking to move to the area. What do you have available? Do they have demand? Are they pushing rents? So if you call 3 of the comp properties and their rents are $200 a unit higher, that's encouraging, because
Right.
then you know that you can probably push rents if you start following whatever they're doing.
And if I can just add to that as well, don't ever take the broker's word on where you can push it, because remember, the broker is there to do one thing: sell you a property.
Right.
So you can take the information, you can take their comps, you can look at them, you can start figuring out, wow, okay, I see it. But remember, what are they going to show you? They're probably going to show you the best comps. You want to see the worst comps as well, so that you can get a range of what's going on in that market and
Yep.
where your property lies in that range.
Absolutely. That is very important. So, while the brokers will not, they generally won't lie in the pro forma in the OM, they certainly will show you a best case scenario.
Right.
So unfortunately in life, things don't always come in the best case scenario. So we want to prepare for a realistic scenario. And then if we get best case, we exceed.
Mm-hmm. And
So-
it's also good because when you're raising capital from your investors and when you're talking to people, it's always good to sound, well, it's not just to sound, but you want to know your market. You want to know what's going on in your area. What are the properties renting for? Yeah, that property across the street is doing this. This property across the street is doing that. That one down the block is doing this. It gives your investors a sense of comfort when you're sharing this information with them, that they know you've done your homework. You know what's going on in the market, rather than just saying, oh yeah, well, the broker told me.
Yep.
The broker could tell you a lot of things.
Right.
Yep.
So I was going to say, Nissan, do you want to open it up for some questions, and we'll see if anybody has
Sure.
any questions on it?
Sure, let's do that. If anybody has any questions right now, you can raise your hand. Does anybody have any questions? Let's see. I think we're good. No one right now has any questions. So we did have one question going back to the economic vacancy. So they're asking, how do you actually calculate economic vacancy in order to add it to the effective vacancy?
Good question. So we'll take that right from our trailing financials. So keep in mind that every set of financials will be a little bit different from the other set, but you want to look for the line items that are part of the economic vacancy. So in this one, it would be concessions. So a concession is any type of discount you're giving off your standard lease rate. So if you're charging $750 for a unit, and all of a sudden you have a special where if they move in today, they're getting a discount of $75 each month over the course of that lease, then that $75 a month goes into your concession. So that's economic vacancy. Delinquency, this is late rent, or something that's been written. Well, they don't have a separate section for write-offs, so they're probably including their write-offs in here. But it's anybody that hasn't paid that you haven't been able to collect on. So this is also economic vacancy. So what you do is you look at your financials, you find all of the items that would fit into economic vacancy, and you take a total on there, and then you take your total, and whatever that number is, you divide it by your gross potential income, and that'll give you the percentage used for economic vacancy. So in this case, it was a fairly minimal amount. And I think part of the reason for that is because they actually have part of it baked into their gross potential income, because they don't have a true gross potential income on them. Starting out, again, that may be a little more complex, but as you start looking at a couple hundred deals, you'll get used to it. So what you do is you're taking the number, and what the formula here is doing is it's calculating it based on the gross potential income to figure out that percentage.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions right now? Let's see. Does anybody have any questions for Charles or myself about underwriting? And Charles, so right now we spent the last hour inputting all of the information from the T12, from the income and expense report, into the underwriting, right? And we figured out what is the property doing now based on the purchase price, right? And the numbers that were given. Now we kind of hit on it a little bit, right? So now we're looking at, all right, we're buying it here at this point in time. What is the property going to look like once we start adding value to it, right?
Right.
The numbers, I was talking yesterday and I was showing in my master class how we bought a property at a 6 cap, and by raising the rent within 2 years, we brought it up based on the purchase price to a 9 cap. And we said, okay, the NOI after 2 years of increasing is now a 9 cap based on the purchase price. Well, what if we took that NOI and we brought it down back to a 6 cap to where we bought it at? What was the value at that point? And the property increased by about $500,000. So how do you show that here? How do people go about and understanding what the upside is when they're underwriting?
Good question. So on the upside, easiest way to do that is going to be on the P&L worksheet. And this will give us an indication of how the property is performing year by year. So we can see the growth in income, the growth in expenses. And then at the bottom of it, what it also shows us is the cash on cash return.
Mm-hmm.
And at the very bottom, the debt coverage ratio. Now, there's a section here where what it does is it takes the NOI, and we'll expand these columns here. So what it's doing right here is it's showing us with the NOI for each year, by applying the cap rates that are listed here, this is what the value of the property would be at that time.
Mhm.
So if we were to sell the property based on whatever cap rate we're choosing, that would be what we should expect to receive as a sale price.
Now I see your assumptions are an annual rent escalator of 2% and so forth. What, you showed in your underwriting that we're going to put about $2 million of renovations into it,
Right.
and we're going to give the rent a big bump first. Where can we see that big bump, or how do we calculate what that bump is?
Good question. So with the initial underwriting, what I would tell you, if you're just starting out,
Mhm.
I would probably recommend speaking to a property manager, to somebody that's more experienced, to understand the magnitude of that bump.
Okay.
But once you feel confident doing it yourself, so let's assume, for the sake of this example, we could apply a $150 rent increase across the board.
Mhm.
So this property has 240 units. While I'd love to say that we could upgrade all 240 in 1 year, probably not going to be possible.
Right.
From somebody much wiser than me, they mentioned to me that probably 8 to 10 units is about what you can do per month if everything goes perfect. Most times things don't go perfect. When it comes down to perfect, that means your lease expiration schedule has to fall in sync with it.
Mhm.
So there's two different schools of thought. You could either vacate more units and do more of the work faster, but the negative side to that is you're impacting your cash flow, which makes it tougher for you to pay your mortgage and tougher for you to pay your investors.
Mhm.
So the approach we normally take is we prefer to keep occupancy strong as we do work and just do it as units turn. So if you go that approach, you need your lease expirations to really line up. And then you need to have enough tenants that are willing to leave in order for you to start upgrading those units. So usually I would figure 5 to 6 units a month. And if you do more than that, it's a bonus. So for purpose of this example, let's just say we have, 240 units in total. Let's say we're doing 6 units a month. We're probably about 40 months. So that's going to put us a little over 3 years. From experience, a property this size, I think 3 years probably will be enough. We can do it a little bit faster than that. And, maybe even 2.5, but I'd always recommend underwriting it conservatively. And if you do 2.5, then that's a bonus. Then you can start realizing that value so much sooner. So what I would do here is scenario 4 is where I typically play with my numbers. So let's figure we're going to get a $150 increase for this example. And what we want to do is we want to factor part of that increase in year 1, part in year 2, and part in year 3. And the reason we're doing that is because it's going to take us 3 years to complete the project. So we don't want to assume that we're going to get the entire bump in year 1 because that's unrealistic. Okay, so what we'll do here is we're going to take the formula, which it's just carrying it from the previous cell. And what we'll do is we're going to factor in $50 a unit, 12 months a year, 240 units. Now you're probably saying, why am I putting $50 in there? So the increase we're getting for each unit is $150. The reason I'm doing that is because the increases on year 2 and 3, we're going to put in this P&L tab, and it's going to be in the average monthly rent amount. So by adding $50 each year, what we're doing is realizing that $150 increase over a 3-year period. Okay, so now what we have in here for each of these years is a $50 increase, and that's our value add increase from the upgrade. That they usually refer to that as the upgrade premium. And then we also have our organic rent bump. So just because you get the value add increase doesn't mean you sacrifice the organic bump, because there's still a cost of living increase in most markets. So now with this example, our numbers look a little bit different. They're still not where we would want them to be, but they're a lot better than we were. So now we have a 6.4% cash on cash return. We have an 8.89% average annual return and an 8.73% IRR. So you'll have a tough time finding investors to invest in that deal still. So at this point, the only real option you have would be really adjusting your purchase price. So that would be the one thing that would make the impact here, but it's a big improvement from where they were.
Right. So that's how you take a 240 unit property and underwrite it. It takes time, right? It's not something that you can rush through. There's a lot of questions. Does anybody here have any questions right now? Let's see. Anybody? This is your time to ask. Okay. So just to recap, right? First thing, when you're looking to underwrite your property, first thing you do is you ask your broker, hey, can I get actual numbers, actual rent roll, actual T12, trailing income and expense report for the last 12 months. And as Charles mentioned, the reason why we want actual numbers is because we want to see what has been the story of the property in real time or real life, right? These numbers are the numbers that we are going to inherit on day one, right? So it's nice to look at your projections and say, oh, wow, we're going to decrease our contract services. Well, that's great, but you're not going to do it in day one. You may be able to do it within a couple of months after you negotiate contracts or find other vendors that'll come in for less money. But in day one, this is what you're going to inherit. So you need to know what you're going to inherit on day one, the actual numbers. And you want to underwrite based on your actual numbers. Now, Charles also mentioned that when we're doing our numbers, we want to do it the way lenders are going to underwrite. So they're taking your T3, the last 3 months of your income, and then they're annualizing that. But then they're taking the last 12 months of your expenses, and that's what they're going to go by. And you have to understand what each line item is. Is it a contract service? Is it a vendor, or is it a repair and maintenance? And you go line by line, and it's time consuming, but as with anything, right? It's in the details. You got to really focus on the details. $1,000 here, $50,000 there could really throw off your numbers. And then you close on a property and you're not hitting your projections and you've got egg on your face, right? So you always want to do that. You want to make sure that you're underwriting it correctly. Now, when you're looking at the T12, before you even start underwriting it, you want to scan it. You want to look for anomalies. You want to look, well, why, as Charles said, why is it in August that income or vacancy shot down, decreased, and then in April or May, it went up again? What's the story here? Why are they advertising? Why are they spending so much on advertising? So you want to make notes as you're going through the T12 so you can go back to the broker and ask these questions. Why, what's going on here, right? I know that advertising shouldn't be so high. Why is it so high? Why are contract services like this? What's going on with utilities, right? So these are questions that you want to ask. And then you want to have some sort of underwriting tool. Either you can create, you can purchase, you can do whatever you want. And everybody's underwriting tool is going to look different, right? And I've noticed and I've learned that depending on how people think, that's how they like to see their underwriting tool created, right? Some people like it like this, some people like that. There's no right and wrong. It's just you got to make sure that what you're inputting, as Charles said, what you're inputting is correct, because that's what's important, right? And then on top of that, you want to make sure that you're doing your numbers conservatively, your projections conservatively. Make sure that when you're out there and you're looking for how much can I increase rent? Well, do your own market research, call different properties, ask, reach out to different property management companies and interview them and ask them, hey, what are your thoughts on this area? What are your thoughts on this property? I was thinking that we could do it like this, or we could do this, or we can do that. Property management companies, understand the value of knowing what's going on in the market so that they can help you with this, right? And it's not necessarily the property management company. You can also be the actual on-site property manager that will know, because a property management company, they'll go and they'll hire a property manager who is local. and who knows that market very well. So you want to make sure that the person that is sitting in your office at your property knows the area, knows the market, has been in there, understands renovations, understands how to deal with vendors and so forth, so that you can get the best bang for your dollar. Charles, anything else you want to add to that before we send our listeners home?
Lisa, I think that sums it up really well.
Awesome.
But to further just reiterate on that last point with the property managers, actually, give you guys a quick real life example that Nissan and I are the property we're actually involved in together. And we had bought a property in a tertiary market last year. Initially, when we first started looking at it, the property manager had given us a rent projection that, I'll be honest, I didn't think she'd be able to hit. We knew the rents were undervalued, and we were confident saying that they were at least, $125 to $150 undervalued. But she gave us a number that was even $100 higher than that. And I said, I just don't see that number. But I don't know the market as well as she does. So the little bit of homework that I did, wasn't like her working in the market every day. So thankfully she was right and I was wrong. And the good news is she was able to hit that higher number. But what happens is, by projecting conservatively, it gives you a realistic base, but it makes it also possible to exceed that number and make your investors much happier.
That's right. Now, we didn't tell our investors that we were going to, or we didn't underwrite with that extra $100 bump that she suggested. We kept it at our conservative numbers that Charles underwrote and looked at it. And now, tomorrow, when we have our conference call, right? Or when we had our conference call and we shared this information with our investors that we projected rents to be 700, but now, or go from 7 to 800, but now we're actually at 900. Look how awesome we look. We look like Supermen, right? Especially Charles, because he underwrote it and he said, you know what, we're coming in conservatively, but now we're exceeding expectations. And this is what you want to do with your investors. You want to exceed expectations. You don't want to do the opposite. You don't want to come in and say, well, we thought we were going to hit 900, but we really hit 850. Well, it's still more than 700. It's still more than 750. It's still more than 800, but we told them 900, but we came in under. And I'll share with you a story, if quick story on that, is that I still do fix and flips, and I have a friend in Texas, and he's doing some flips, and I group my friends together, and we send them money and so forth. So I told one of my friends, I said, listen, great opportunity. In about 5 to 6 months, we're going to flip this house, and we're going to make about 33% return on our money in 5 months, maybe 6 months, which is a great return, right? Great return. Well, we came in and we sold the property in 4 months, 2 months before, but we only made, I think, 29 or 30% on our money. How many of you would be like, wow, that is fantastic. 4 months instead of 6, we made 30%. That's awesome. That's awesome. You know what was the first thing that he said to me? He goes, didn't you say 33%? I said, yes, I said 33, but I also said 6 months. He goes, yeah, I get it, but you said 33, right? If I would have told him 25% in 6 months and came back to him with 30% in 4 months, I would have looked like the hero. He wouldn't have a question. But because I told him 33% and I gave him 30, that didn't quite sit right. So always under promise and over deliver, be conservative on your numbers. And even if that upside is there and you can hit it, dial it back when you're telling your investors so that you can really hit your marks and look like a superhero for your investors. Okay. I want to thank everybody for being here. Charles, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know we've got a lot of things on our plate and we gotta do this, but and thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your knowledge and demystifying underwriting. I'm Nitan Mosry, the traveling investor. Charles, thank you so much for being here. We will send out this recording. It'll also be uploaded to my YouTube channel. It's called The Traveling Investor. If you haven't already done so, go to YouTube, Check out the Traveling Investor YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, comment, share, do all that. You can find me on all social media platforms, as well as Charles. And once again, thank you so much for being here and happy hunting. We'll talk to you guys soon.